for coming to our EHS community webinar on field safety, what's going on way out there. I'm Jonathan. I am our Director of Risk Management and Safety Education and your host and moderator for today. And we're joined by two wonderful panelists who will be introducing themselves very shortly. And this should be just a fantastic time. Just some tips to help with the engagement, any sort of fun chat type things put in the chat. And then any interesting questions that you do want to ask, put in the Q&A, please. It's easier to keep track of the Q&A, so questions that end up in the chat often get lost in the scroll, or we may not notice them right away or whatever. So please do that. Please do get engaged. We love that you come to these. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that people can see us much easier. There we go. Hey, how's that? And that's good. So let's get going. And I'll just go around the horn. So Heather, you're right below me on my screen. And so I'll ask you, if you don't mind, introducing yourself, please. Thanks.
Sure. So shall I go forward or backward chronologically?
Well, you know, whatever you think. I would say go backwards, and that way, whatever amount of time you end up using, you can always stop and you won't have missed like what you're doing now, right?
Right. Okay. Yeah. My name is Heather Spaulding. I use she, her pronouns. I am the field safety professional at the University of California, Davis, in the Department of EH&S. And yeah, I have a background before EH&S. I worked in research labs and worked in the field, you know, at UC Davis, other universities. I worked for the Park Service for a little while. So I got to see and learn a lot of interesting things in the field. And of course, when I first started in science and scientific research, I had to figure out a lot of things for myself, especially safety-wise, because there weren't so many resources available at the time. So that's kind of my motivation, right? Like, how can I help other folks who are just starting out to find those resources they need?
Yeah, great,
That's
great.
me.
And am I correct? Do I remember correctly, Heather, you're the first field safety professional at UC Davis?
I am. There was one other person for a brief time before I started, but it was a part-time role. He had other responsibilities in the department. So
first full-time, that's it.
Yeah, first full-time.
Cool, great. All right, and Miriam, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Miriam Sharp. I work at the University of Maryland, College Park. I am the manager of the laboratory safety program and a chemical hygiene officer for the university. So my sort of interest in field has sort of started as soon as I, started in the safety program, and I've sort of expanded my empire of, my sphere of influence for all research labs, even the ones that don't technically have walls. So we are looking at those groups that are sort of more the non-traditional, and as well as we're looking into doing the studio spaces for art. So there's definitely sort of expansion, and field safety is sort of near and dear to my heart. My professional background is in geology. So I have a PhD in geology, and field work has been sort of a part of my education, and sort of what I wanted to do sort of initially, professionally, and then sort of moving into safety. It's definitely been something I've kept up with, and been very active in sort of pushing it forward to on the national scale with organizations like SHIMA.
Yep, neat. So it's really neat. Both of you, of course, are have lots of experience in the field. So Miriam, I know we've talked about this. Was that really the basis of your journey into field health and safety? Was your experiences as a geologist and all?
Yeah, so initially, when I was getting my PhD in geology, like I did a lot of field work. I was a planetary geologist. There's a geologic map of the moon behind me. So people wanted to know what that was, but yeah, so like for me, I really did some field work, and I really enjoyed it. But I also know that there was no real safety sort of outline guidance, resources,
Mm,
training, nothing really existed.
mm,
And when I sort of made the journey into sort of administration in terms of academic administration, which is in, basically in the health and safety field, but it's really in the support of research. And that's really
mhm,
where I wanted to take my career. So I sort of kind of fell into research safety. And really, when I was hired, it was more like strict laboratory chemical safety.
mhm.
That was my position. However, in sort of learning about the field, there was a lot of sort of emphasis on, oh, that we've had a death in a laboratory environment. We've had these explosions, we've had people injured, and there's a lot of regulatory concern about that. And for me, I remember stories, being told around, our, graduate student beer hour of, somebody fell in the field and, broke their ankle. They needed to be, dragged out of the, it was a grad student and an undergrad. The undergrad fell. They couldn't find each other for a couple hours. Students' legs swole up,
Sure.
very, very big. They finally got them to the car and then promptly got the car stuck on a rock in the middle of, of forest in Brazil. Their cell phones didn't work. It was 12 hours later by the time they were able to go to a clinic and even get
Wow.
seen. Their PI was in India on his own field research experience. So they were by themselves. They didn't have any emergency preparations. And the way that this story was sort of relayed to me was, kind of like, oh, this is this crazy thing that happened.
Mm,
And thinking about it from like an EH&S standpoint of like, there's no preparation, there's no training, there's no sort of risk assessment and sort of plan in place for when things go wrong. And then sort of researching about it, there have been many fatalities in the field,
right.
even in
Right.
academic institutions, that have affected like US institutions. So it's been something that is sort of higher on the radar for me, as sort of somebody who's now sort of in the management of safety
Mhm.
programs. And, we've been sort of slowly building up resources and across the country, I think there's been
Sure.
a sort of big push to start getting into that.
Sure. Okay. And Heather, what about for you? Is it similar to what Miriam's talking about? And maybe along those lines, what have you learned since starting the as a full-time person the field safety program there?
Yeah, I think like Miriam has a great point about how, traditionally we take laboratory safety, industrial safety, that sort of thing, much more seriously than
Mm,
field safety and working at remote locations. And
right.
there has been that culture of, well,
Mm,
there are just inherent risks to working in the backcountry or working outdoors. And I think it really doesn't have to be that way. So I'm hoping, and I think I'm seeing a culture shift actually,
sure.
quite a bit, which is encouraging. But yeah, things that I've learned so much really since since starting up this program and working with a lot of researchers. So one of the big things is just think about how I worked on some of those first field safety plans with people coming through. So
Mm,
they're going to a certain field site, they're doing this type of activity. And so I would, pull out a plan template and start going through the list of all of the hazards. Like, okay, you have poison oak there, you have, mosquitoes and ticks and this and that, and ankle sprains and scrapes and bruises. And that can be really overwhelming,
mm,
just listing all of these things, especially to someone who is new, a grad student, or, a field technician who hasn't had a lot of experience in a certain area. And
right.
so, one of the big things I've learned is to start with the basics, really start with those
Mhm,
core elements of planning. Like, do you have a communication plan? Who is your
mhm.
support team? Who's supporting you in the field? Who's supporting you back on campus?
Sure.
Do you have just a broad hazard assessment? Do you know what to do if
Right.
things go sideways?
Yeah. Cool. Let's talk more about this. So for both of you, and I'm just gonna go back and forth between, started with Miriam, now I'll start with Heather, and We'll see if I can keep it straight in my mind. I'm not so sure these days. So Heather, starting with you. So what sorts of field activities are we talking about? It says field, but there's also field research, which, maybe dominates it in our mind, but it isn't exclusive to that. Do we have any maybe working definitions, and do both of you get asked, does this, count towards, what your program umbrella covers?
Yeah, definitely. It's a broad definition. It's kind of it's a little fuzzy around the edges how we define field work, for sure,
Yeah.
because I base it on what kind of resources I can provide to somebody. But if somebody's working at a remote location up in the mountains, way out somewhere in the desert, in the valley, where there's no reliable communication, where they're not near a hospital or other resources in case of emergency, where they have to be somewhat self-contained, that's field research or field work. Also, if someone's traveling internationally, we support them out of this department. If folks are going into a city nearby and doing some kind of some kind of clinical outreach, because we have like medical and nursing students who might be doing some kind of clinical outreach, visiting people in private homes. These are all areas where we can provide some resources and support to people who are just in an environment that's not part of the university. And I had a question from somebody, even just last week, I met somebody and, I was talking about the program, and I said, oh, so do you do any field work as a researcher? And they said, no, not really, not really field work. Well, what do you do? Well, I go out in a boat out in the marsh and I take samples. I'm like, oh, do you have good cell phone service when you're there? Or, well, when I get back to the dock, there's cell phone service. Okay, that's interesting. It's really interesting to hear how people define field work.
Oh my goodness. I think I've had that conversation before with researchers. Always a little odd at times how we interpret things. Miriam, what about for you at UMD, these same sort of challenges as Heather has described?
Yeah, we don't really have a formal program, so to speak. So, but we do have like a series of resources, and really kind of where we sort of draw the lines is where there's other support available. So there are lots of regulatory requirements for something like education abroad, so study abroad programs. So there's like an office sort of dedicated to them. So we would consider them sort of on a separate sort of entity. A lot of the business travel sort of doesn't necessarily fall into fieldwork categories, but there's a lot that does. And then there are sort of side cases like farming, areas where we've got researchers working on, farms that we own as a university. So it's not necessarily even off university property, but it's in sort of a more remote area. We have lots of urban field researchers who sort of are working in, places like Baltimore or DC, or even in the local community. We have a lot of field courses. We've got journalism courses, we've got archaeology courses that will be sort of embedded somewhere sort of periodically. There's some field schools. We don't necessarily own some of these field schools, but we will be sending our students to field schools, co-ops, internships. There's kind of like all these sort of side cases where, depending on who's really responsible for the health and safety, there's definitely sort of investigations that are needed. So there's lots of side cases. And it's not even just researchers either. We do have like we had an art professor go to Greenland. He was engaged with somebody, another professor who was working on climate science, but he was sort of collecting sort of experiences and his experience there, and he was collecting, I think, parts. He was kind of doing a side project with this person who was doing climate science so that he could do an art installation related to climate science, specifically in Greenland. So, and apparently had his had an interaction with a polar bear, from what
Oh,
I have heard.
oh,
So,
oh my goodness.
but yeah, so I mean, it's very, very widely variable,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
more you look, the more people are doing it.
Yep. Yeah. We have a couple of comments in the chat. Kim let us know that I don't know if it's she or he, because I know Kims that are men, but where Kim has said we have called it off-campus research. And then Richard posted about at Oregon State and how it used to be a little kind of, I will just say a little wild back there. It's like go out, get samples, come back alive, sort of a thing. So, what's interesting is we were chatting about this. I was thinking for myself. So Miriam and I both have education in geology. Miriam eclipses mine. She has a PhD. Mine's just a bachelor's. But I spent some time working for an environmental engineering firm. And so we did haz waste sites, dirty dirt, tank yanks, and Superfund and everything in between, which was a blast, especially when I was younger. And so we, if you're familiar with that reg, you have to do a HASP, health and safety plan. And it's geared towards everything we're talking about. It's not necessarily research. We're collecting samples, yes, but it's for an actual project. So yeah, plus which I did want to mention. So Miriam mentioned about dealing with, I guess, actual, say like farm animals and all. And of course, where Heather is, where I used to be at UC Davis, it's an Aggie college. So Davis is known for two things, bikes and cows, right? So there you go. There's a lot. All right. So let's continue along these lines. So the next thing is, if it's so diverse and so hard to pin down, researchers don't even think they do work in the field, even though they go out in boats, right? Sort of stuff. How do we even find out who's doing what? What are some things? What are some categories or ways that you figure this out? Or maybe you partner with others, such as travel office, et cetera, IRB office. I don't know. So, and I think, let's see, I got to go with whoever was last and then goes first. So Miriam, to you, and we're going to continue and see how many of these questions we can get to here. So go ahead and give us a brief on that, Miriam.
Yeah, so I mean, this is something that I've been sort of working over the last I believe like 5 or 6 years on specifically, identifying how can we sort of establish metrics, how do we get this information, and we've sort of been able to embed it in a few different ways in a few different places, and we're getting sort of overlap, and we're sort of expanding. So the first place that we started was the IACUC, so our Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. They have a protocol list. One of the things that we sort of were able to talk to them about, and depending on the scope of the IACUC, like they can sort of choose to include sort of like these field activities or not. Like it depends on the scope of the IACUC and at your institution. But our institution was interested in sort of tracking and seeing field research or field activities. And so that became sort of a part of the evaluation. Other groups that I've worked with, the Institutional Biosafety Committee as well, they sort of start to track things like, if field is mentioned or if basically sample collection is mentioned, it sort of comes under a little bit of scrutiny. We have been working with our sponsored research office to get sort of added to the questionnaire of, they track a lot of import export, some other regulatory items, some other items related to laboratory safety, if they're going to be using biological materials, radioactive materials. But now we've got a couple things associated with boating, field work, and farm work. So we've got a number of avenues there, and the one that I'm really excited about is our university as a whole is updating its travel administration sort of plan. So we are doing this administrative modernization project where they're going to be overhauling the travel request system, and we're sort of working with a commercial partner that's able to sort of identify questions that we can ask, and sort of knowing the right people and getting involved with our Office of International Risk Management that sort of handles study abroad, as well as risk management for business travel, and the business office. We've been able to sort of make it a point to start collecting this information and being able to filter it by using some data collection.
Mm.
And because previously our business office could do international travel, so we knew that we had 40,000 trips in the last
Sure.
year, but we couldn't tell you how much of that was conference, how much
Mm.
of that was field, how much of it was
Okay.
research or study abroad. So that's
Yeah. Interesting in particular for me, and of course working in software, keyword searches. And so looking for things perhaps to key in on activities. Heather, what about for you at UC Davis? How do these sorts of challenges tend to play out there?
Yeah, it's pretty similar to what Miriam said. We have uh, um, basically it's just about making connections with a lot of those different groups.
Mm.
You said, so I do a lot of outreach. I go to any tabling event that I can, which,
Mhm.
it doesn't sound like such a big picture thing. I might not be meeting as many administrators, but I'm meeting the people who are actually going out into the field, who are actually doing the research. And there's a lot of that just spreads by word of mouth. People just email me, people who I've never heard of, like, hey, can I sign up for your first aid training? Can I check out a satellite communicator, first aid kit, that kind of thing. But yeah, I work with our travel security program. We have
Mm.
a policy at UC Davis where you have to register international travel. And so that all goes through travel security manager. And, when he sees somebody who's traveling internationally, it looks like they're doing field work, he'll send them over to me for resources.
Right.
Similar with our occupational health clinic has a travel medicine
Mm.
service. And so,
Mm.
when someone is traveling and they're asking for vaccinations, anti-malarial medication, consultation, that kind of thing, they'll also give that person resources for me or just connect us directly for whatever
Sure.
resources they need. So, and every campus is going to have different programs, different ways of gathering that kind of
Mm.
information, but
Yeah.
it's a challenge to pull it all together.
Yeah, it is. You know what? It just occurred to me, we have the two coasts represented here with the both of you, right? Miriam's on the East Coast. Heather's on the West Coast, a little bit in Northern Cali. I'm up in the corner in Maine right now, and usually down in the Southwest. So in a way, we've kind of almost got the four corners. Not quite Florida or Seattle per se, but we're pretty widespread. But it is interesting the similarities, regardless of that. And in particular, I think my big takeaway is you really need to use as many different opportunities and channels, just like we do in marketing, to get your message out. And I think most of us in EH&S know that we need to promote what we're doing because it's so hard for people to know who to go to and what the resources are and all of that sort of stuff. So let's move on to what we're going to call the realities, if they're that, of what we should focus on, which I think is somewhat of a loaded topic area, right? So, but there's some seriousness to this as well, right? So, how should we be concerned about personal security besides just regular occupational health and safety? And Heather, this time I'll ask you if you don't mind starting us out in that area, please.
Yeah, that's definitely an area that maybe has not received as much attention in the past, but hopefully is getting a little more attention now. Definitely depending on where people are traveling, what kind of area they're working in, if they're going to be in an area where they're interfacing with the public potentially. Personal safety, protection against violence and harassment is definitely a big concern. And now more than ever, we have a more diverse workforce, a more diverse cohort of students, grad students, new researchers who have to be aware of different types of threats. I might go to a field site that I've gone to for years, feel comfortable completely, but then if I have a colleague who has a different identity or who looks different from me, they might be treated differently. And that's something that, we can't make assumptions about how safe a location is based on our own past experience there.
Right. I mean, it could be external to the researchers, or it could even be internal, which, both, of course, are very sad. Our colleague and my friend Anthony Appleton is on, and he had shared with me when he was a panelist on our JEDI cultures, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, a very good article that gets at this. We'll be sure to post that and any other resources that we discuss when we post the recording as well. That's typically how we do it, so that everyone has an equal opportunity to access them. Miriam, what about from your perspective on this issue of personal safety?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to extricate personal safety and security
Mm,
um, from your overall safety and security in a field environment. It's not like it is in a laboratory where like there's different units sort of responsible for different aspects of your safety and security.
mm,
It's all sort of wrapped together. Your location is going to have specific hazards that are unique. What you're doing, I mean, you might be fine doing a specific type of study if you're doing water testing in one area, but if you're doing a survey and you're talking to people in the same exact location, that
mm,
activity is going to have different potential hazards, risks. When I was sort of talking to people who were sort of going into urban field environments, even the language that scientists use in
mm,
specific populations can be very powerful. So they would be sort of really cognizant of if you talk about an introduced species versus an invasive species, one has the connotation that the scientists are releasing something into the
mm,
environment as opposed to something that has come by other means.
mm,
And so even and for like graduate students, they might not always be thinking about the type of language that they're using and the impact that it might have. But I think you really just can't extricate an emergency situation that might happen in a field can be security, and it could be the general safety, heat stress
Yep.
related, for example.
Mhm.
You just the same preparations, the same planning applies.
Mm.
That it's very different than the general laboratory environment.
Sure. No, absolutely. Yeah. And Sarah posted in the chat that she cautions their wildlife folks to think about endemic disease in humans, where they're going, civil unrest. Don't just focus on animals or ecosystem risks. It's not just about the poisonous beasts in the field. And the sun is streaming in here, and I don't have any way to stop it. I apologize for that, folks. I'll try to turn. No, that's not going to help. Hey, that's a little bit better. We'll try that. So yeah, sometimes the beasts that we have to be the most concerned about are actually ourselves, human beasts. I'll just briefly say that I read a very, very sad article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed several years ago when I was at Arizona State, and it was talking about sexual harassment and sexual assault in the field. And it was incredibly sad. It caused me to realize that I didn't know what was going on in the field. And I reached out to our Title IX coordinator and asked if she'd like to partner on an effort to deal with both of these traditional health and safety and obviously Title IX issues, sexual harassment and all. And she responded with, "Oh my God, yes, absolutely, John. Let's do that." So yeah, there's a lot of there. Yeah. Now let's get into more of this reality of claims. We've talked a little bit about tales of woe that after a while we all start to say, oh, this was just a jolly old fun time where John broke his leg and we had to, portage him out in the canoe or something ridiculous like that, right? They say pain plus time equals humor, so go figure. So along these lines, where do you see the claims mostly coming from? What sort of activities? And I think we're to Miriam to give us if you can, a brief on that, so we can get as many different things on covered as we can here.
Well, I think it's certainly something that we're trying to track more with the use
Mm,
of our international insurance in order to actually get metrics, because we don't have people generally reporting these things to us
mm,
in a way that other incidents are reported to the university. We have noticed that there are, in terms of field incidents, vehicles are, ranked very high up there in terms of, just the frequency of events that happen. What we find for international insurance so far, we've only had it for a couple of years, and obviously COVID has made international travel not exactly business as usual.
right.
But the issues that they keep finding are more or less mental health related. It is an area where people don't necessarily appreciate how different their environment's going to be, how much more stress they're going to be, especially when they're separated from their sort of support systems at home. And that can be aggravated by international travel. And that's where we kind of see some of the claims sort of starting, but we're sort of really in the beginning of, establishing some of these, metrics in terms of actually being able to drive that. In terms of the um, overall fatalities that have happened in the field, murder, civil unrest, it's been vehicles, it's been boating, it's been falls, it's been glacier crossings and crevasse falls,
Mm,
drownings, heat stress, heat stroke. It sort of goes across all the different types of hazards. Hantavirus, people getting sort of sick because of where they were staying or what they were
sure.
doing. So there's just a lot out there, and it hasn't really been categorized in here's the top three. That would be easy, that would be great, but it really hasn't had that sort of evaluation that because the metrics haven't really been gathered
Mm.
overall.
Okay, great. Yeah. And Heather, what about you? And I'm going to go off camera and try to move so that I'm not getting so much sun interfering here. But go ahead, please, Heather.
Okay, you're gonna try and turn the sun off for just a moment, but not for too long because
Exactly.
we need it. Um, yeah, it's some of the same challenges. We don't have really clear metrics necessarily on all of the incidents that are happening in the field, whether that's physical incidents like vehicle accidents, vehicle damage, physical injuries, those more like psychological injuries, harassment incidents. A lot of this, I was actually at in a workshop about a week ago where we talked about how these things get reported and how a lot of these incidents are probably underreported, honestly. Oh, great lighting. Yeah, especially things that aren't those traditional physical injuries that someone would go to an emergency room for in a moment, right? Um, so probably everything gets a little bit underreported. And I made a note as Miriam was talking on research trips versus field courses or class field trips. Just thinking about a trip where you have a professor leading a group of undergrads out to the field, they're probably more likely to report injuries or incidents that they're aware of. But someone who's going out to the field on their own, a grad student doing extended study somewhere, might not report every little thing. We might not
Yeah.
be aware of the importance of doing that. So
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Yeah.
to follow up on that, like I
Go
feel
ahead.
like sometimes depending on the reporting, there's certain requirements to report for OSHA, but that doesn't apply to students who are not paid. And we've had
Mm,
some issues with workers' comp numbers, not our workers' comp not applying to researchers who were, kind of volunteering their time. I mean, it's part of their research,
mm,
but they kind of fell off the payroll, so to speak.
mm,
And in their mind, they never changed. They're still part of the University of Maryland, but on paper, like that metric, where they were injured because they were walking through a marsh field or in a river in Newark, New Jersey, and pierced their foot with a rebar. you
mm.
know they they weren't able to get the assistance that they needed from the university. They reported it because they thought it fell under workers' comp, but it did not. So
Sure.
it's
Yeah.
it's difficult.
Yeah, yeah. No, I totally get it. So another question for something that people may or may not really be thinking about, and this came to me from, again, the Title IX coordinator is, what about concerns that maybe a student researcher might get omitted due to the organizer or leader wanting to minimize so-called challenging needs? So, along the lines of a PI, maybe avoiding including women because of any misconstrued concerns there, persons of color, marginalized groups, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm losing track. I think Heather goes first next, but who knows?
Yeah, that's a really challenging one. And
Yeah.
I've heard those anecdotes too. Somebody was told that they shouldn't participate in whatever project because of their identity, because they would be more at risk in whatever location the lab was doing research in. And that's really tough. I can see where a PI might think they're doing the right thing by protecting their students, but it's just another way that that marginalized people end up losing out on opportunities. If you're excluding people from a certain activity because you think it's too dangerous for them, they're missing out on the education there. They're missing out on career advancement opportunities. And really, if an area, location, activity is too dangerous for that one group, like maybe it's too dangerous for everybody in your lab. Like maybe you shouldn't be going to a location where you're that concerned about the safety of some of your group members.
No, sure, definitely. Miriam, what about from your perspective there?
I think there's a lot of aspects to this. Where was I going with this? So I think there's just a lot of I think there's a lot of ways where in the lack in where we lack guidance at the university, people are going to make up their own rules. They're going to make up their own procedures and evaluate risk themselves. So unless you have sort of guidelines about it, people are going to be making these decisions. And there are, drivers for that. So, they might be asking for medical information because we can't call the university health center or your pharmacy to find out the dosage of your medication when you're in the middle of Bhutan. Like, it's just not something that the situation is varied enough that you can't really follow guidelines. And so people are kind of making it up as they go, and they do run into trouble. What I think would help sort of reset the mindset of researchers is think about screening on and educating on, not screening out or keeping people out of an experience. And this is something that I really think is very important. You give people the opportunity, the information, and they make an educated sort of assessment and they have their own personal judgment involved. Now, there are sort of limitations to this, and sort of depending on the risk tolerance of the university or the institution at large, there may be sort of no-go zones. So you run into this with risk tolerance a lot, and I know that sort of came up in the questions. And ultimately, it's not we will never know what people are doing and where people are going to the extent that sometimes will make us feel better. We are never going to have complete control over what people do or where people go. People can successfully go to war zones and do research. We have a terrorism studies program, and they do risk assessment for their entire research in very conflict-ridden areas. Now, there are much more sort of aggressive techniques that they use to evaluate and control for those risks, but it can be done. So, in terms of, we need people to stop going to certain places or stop doing certain things, there are ways to sort of support it. It just kind of depends. We're not always involved in where that risk tolerance is. And sometimes we just need to make sure that, leadership is aware and that people are given the appropriate resources to manage their own risk.
Yeah. A couple of quick things that occurred to me. I think what we're talking about is partially informed decision-making by the people involved, give them the opportunity, as I think you both have gotten at very well. And there may be a little bit of a comparison, an analogy to something in OSHA. You can't just exclude a woman who is pregnant from a work area just because there is a chemical or process that causes reproductive harm, or it's a teratogen, right? And there was a very well-known case of that, Johnson Controls, where I think it was like a warehouse, and it was carbon monoxide, which of course is a teratogen. And it was ruled that it was incumbent on the employer to protect her, right? Not to exclude her, not to force her to not work in that situation. It was that they had to protect her. So it's incumbent upon, the employer to properly evaluate it, which can include the phrase I think that we use often is the risk appetite. And the risk appetite can differ widely and wildly between us and between groups based on experience, right? Well, let's keep going. This is great. We're going to actually maybe get one more question in, and then we're going to transition after this question. We'll do our poll, and then we'll do the Q&A, and we'll see how we do there. We have a few questions in the Q&A, so we may bounce back to some of our already planned questions. So what about universal design, holistic thinking, approaches that I think take this overarching or broad view? And feel free to definitely nuance this in the right context and verbiage and all of that. It's your expertise, both of you, not mine. So Miriam, maybe a very brief bit on that, and then Heather, and then we'll do a brief transition.
Yeah, I mean, I think like there are lots of different ways that, in thinking about how we sort of organize, research experiences, and how we sort of think about different types of experience. It feel like geology field camp is, a really good example. It requires a lot of hiking, a lot of visual, elements to it in terms of mapping and field identification. But there may be other ways to, allow researchers to participate in sort of, field experiences that may be a little bit more accessible, based on, it does take a lot of work to sort of make sure that these, programs are adequate and that you're sort of achieving the same effect. But I do see sort of, a push for, being inclusive and providing inclusive experiences in field environments.
Cool.
But again, it's definitely something that, is on the forefront, but there is more interest every day on it.
Cool. Great. Thank you. And Heather, what about from your perspective on this?
Yeah. So, universal design for accessibility in the field, it can be a challenge in the field for sure, because we're not building the environment around us the way that you can design a building to be accessible to everybody. But there's some elements of planning that you can definitely consider, like something as simple as thinking about where the restrooms are near your field site or during a field course, and putting that in the itinerary to tell everybody, all the participants, here, these are the times that we're going to stop for restroom breaks. Here are the locations, that sort of thing. That helps people who might have a medical need to use the restroom more frequently. Right. It also can help a lot with anxiety about, someone going on their first trip and wondering, where am I going to use the restroom? Maybe I shouldn't drink any water if I don't know if we're going to have a restroom, because then you run into other issues. Yeah. So.
Yeah. I was just reflecting back on my own experience. This will be really brief, and climbing down a very steep slope to the Connecticut River, I think it was, but up in Vermont for a Superfund site. And I was in my 30s. I was strong, healthy, young. We had a blast. My research partner and I, our sampling partner and all. Now, would I do that? No. So I think whoever was leading this effort, would have to say, hey, Jonathan, let's talk about getting you to do, can we have you drive the Jeep? Can we have you, something that would be much more appropriate for my physical ability. But, as long as they do it in a nice way, I'm sure I would be open to that. All right, so we're going to do a transition. Chris is going to launch our poll on topics. Please, everyone, vote. Unfortunately, as it says at the bottom there, Heather and Miriam, we cannot vote. Hosts and panelists can't. So sorry. But you can always email us and let us know. But everyone else, as attendees, please, please do vote. This is how we get a lot of the information on what you want and how we decide about different things. And lately, what we've been hearing from you clearly is you want to learn more and more about some of our solutions. So that's, if you were around early in our webinar, you saw that that's some of the stuff that we have coming up. Our next one will be another webinar on ChemTracker. And then after that, a webinar on inspections and that solution, and eventually back to some very cool EH&S community webinars as well, because we do know that people enjoy these and get a lot out of them as well. So good. All right, wonderful. So now let's try to address some of the questions in the Q&A if we can. And since they get voted up and down, I will start at the top. So this one is from Lindsay. And Lindsay asked, do you provide the option for field researchers to check out some sort of GPS unit for remote work? And if so, how do you handle the training on those units? And who is responsible for the cost of the subscription? I think we're to Heather first. I'm going to go to Heather anyway, only because I recall hearing about this when I was at UC Davis. So I know both of you have experience in this, but Heather, do you want to just give us a brief for you, and then we'll go over to Miriam and we'll go on to the next question.
Yeah, at UC Davis, we do have a fleet of satellite communicators that we will send to the field with people. So we have, currently we have Garmin Inreach units. So, and I'm looking to see if I have one in my bag here. I think it's in the other room. I have one that I brought out to set up, and but yeah,
fine.
so they're super handy. They have an SOS button for emergencies. They have two-way texting so that people can have that just frequent check-in with a supervisor. People know where you are, you're sending your location. They're really, really popular.
Great, great. And Miriam, what about at UMD? What do you guys do?
So our EHS department purchased 5 Inreach devices, and we are providing a free rental service to the researchers. So, we do sort of have a clause in there. We do collect financial information. It's like a you break it, you buy it kind of situation. If they lose it, or if they really damage it, or
Sure.
just never return it, like we can sort of recoup that cost. They're only like $450 per unit. That's the one-time cost, and then it's like a $20 a month cost for like their basic program per unit. So it's not a huge cost commitment. We found that, in terms, we had some research funding from our vice president for research. They were interested in having this resource available. And we just launched it last month. So we haven't had any, we had a pilot program where somebody took it to Siberia, and we were able to have that function there. We were able to text that person to sort of iron out some of the kinks. But yeah, so it's EHS supported.
Great. Yeah, nice. Thank you so much. And let's see, Lindsay says they use Inreach as well. And Kim says that they have a pool of satellite phones and Inreach devices as well. Seems to be a little bit of a standard or common one. I'm going to actually do Cynthia's question next because it seems to be related. And then I'll go up to Emily's, definitely. Don't worry about it, Emily. We will definitely get to yours. But Cynthia's, which is related, one of my researchers is interested in getting basic map reading and compass use training for her students. Do you provide such training either in-house, or do you use outside training providers? I know that that's something that has occurred, I recall, at UC Davis. I think it was Alex saying, hey, how do we get shotgun training because we have to deal with polar bears, right? It was something like that. And it was like, yeah, we don't do that in-house, but we'll find you someone. So, but I think I'm to Miriam first on this. So what do you guys do there, Miriam?
So in terms of whether or not, so we don't currently provide any field safety training except for, a consultation. So we've been brought in for example, we have bee researchers who need some anaphylaxis training that we've coordinated with our health center, and I've got some, field safety stuff related to heat stress that I've put on. We'd like to have an online training for all field researchers just to cover like the basics of risk assessment. If it was something specific for like compass and map reading, we might sort of, that would be something that we would expect based on the devices that they had and what materials that they were expected to use, that would be handled in the lab group. If they didn't really, if they were trying to do this, but they didn't really have that expertise, we would probably refer them to maybe the geology department where that, they would have more advanced skills on that. We do have sort of recommendations for external training for first aid, wilderness first aid, and we do have some arborist tree climbing is the more interesting ones for our eagle researchers who have to go into trees to capture eagles' eggs for specific studies. So yeah, I mean, some of it can be very, very specific to what they're doing.
Yeah. Going back decades in my mind now, Miriam, what's the name of the compass we used to use in geology? A Brunton?
Brunton.
Oh my God. This stuff, how do I remember that? And I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning, right? Heather, what about at UC Davis? What sort of approaches do you use for the question and anything else?
Yeah, so for something like map reading and compass use, same as Miriam, that's that type of skill is generally taught within the lab group. But when somebody wants more information on that, we have a great outdoor adventures recreational program on campus. So a lot of students will go to them to go on their first backpacking trip or first rafting trip, and they learn a lot of those outdoor skills.
Yeah.
But I have had more questions about just general outdoor skills, general camping and hiking skills recently. So that might be something that might be a good place to put more attention. That becomes an access issue, for folks who maybe haven't done a lot of recreational hiking and camping before, but they want to get into research. They want to study a certain thing.
Yeah, and Sarah posted a response to Cynthia's, perhaps a local search and rescue group would be willing to train folks. That's where I learned map and compass skills, Sarah said. And I'm aware of at least 2 colleagues in the field of EH&S, both from Maine. One has moved away, and both of them were part of search and rescue response team up here. And I think that that's a really great idea, Sarah, is that, I mean, you think about the skill set that they have to have and how much they are trying to do to actually work themselves out of business, right? Prevent the need for search and rescue. So thank you very much. It's always great when the community itself participates in helping each other. That's so much of what we're trying to do. Well, let's go up to Emily's question as promised. So this was from the chat, but I asked her to post it in the Q&A, which she did, of course. And it was the issue we've run into at our institute is how to regulate specimens collected in the field, right? And those present their own challenges in many ways, I know, that are then brought back to the university for analysis. We try to regulate this through biosafety. However, we have definitely run into the issue of researchers having a lot of higher risk tolerance or lack of thought or understanding on PPE usage, et cetera. So the question is, how do you deal with this, especially given the unknowns around zoonoses, et cetera? And for those unfamiliar with that, that's diseases we can get as humans from animals. I'm sorry. I think we're to Heather first. You two are so polite, right? This is so nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan, for moderating. Yeah, I would start by working with the biosafety team on, what types of PPE, what types of protocols would they like to see ideally, and then what can we accomplish in the field? You're not going to have a biosafety cabinet in the field, most likely, depending on what type of location you're working at. But how can we teach people to don and doff certain PPE in the field and keep things clean? So
Yeah.
yeah, it's just adapting that challenge.
Right. Miriam, what about from your perspective? And then I'm going to add my own experience in the field with this sort of problem. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of concerns, especially where it comes into play, like how you transporting it. Are there
Mm,
import export concerns in terms
mm,
of, are you allowed to even, are there permits in place? Have they gone through sort of like that regulatory thing? Are you, do you have the appropriate permissions to do this, gather the materials that you're gathering?
mm.
Are you doing it the right way? I mean, you don't have hand washing facilities in the field. Is that going to be a big deal? Like those kinds of aspects. And I think, the more you sort of get involved with the IBC, maybe it's the IACUC, maybe it's also export control,
Mm.
maybe it's legal. There's certain, but like if you're on a different type of visa in an international location, there's a pretty famous situation where graduate students and a professor got put in jail in
Mm.
Brazil because they were on tourist visas, but they were doing research, and
Mm.
they the local authorities thought they were doing mineral exploration. They were doing a climate science survey of lake sediment, but they were in jail for a while, and I believe one of the universities posted bail for them to get them out of there. But it took a while, and not understanding sort of what is needed to do this. There's not a guide that says you must do X, Y, and Z. So it does take a little bit of that creative thinking. And that's where like this, EHS can sort of be like, so what kind of permissions are needed? Like if you get that second opinion, and those protocol reviews are a good place for that to happen.
Yeah, sure. Oh, absolutely. That's pretty wild. I was going to very briefly say I've worked on a lot of hazardous waste sites. And of course, we collected a lot of samples that had to go back to an accredited lab. That was just part of it. You put them in coolers, pack them, bring them ice packs, et cetera. And I'd often bring them in because I lived close to a lab. But there was one site we were at in Massachusetts that was very bad. And we actually had a lab with the GC in a van. And one of our people who was very good at that, it might have been also mass spec, and we would collect samples and we would bring them, go through the decon and bring them right to him in the van, and he would run samples right there in the field. So sometimes that's another way around it that I just want to mention. All right, the next one is from Richard. My biggest question is how to hold researchers accountable for safety when they are out in the field. It is a big blind spot in safety, in my opinion. There is no realistic way to make sure researchers are following field safety plans when they are out in the actual quote field. You can't just drop into a field site to make sure everyone is wearing their field orange and hard hats. Any advice? Miriam, if you want to give a few words of wisdom on this one, I'm
Yeah,
sure
I mean,
everyone will be
that's kind of where you're not going to have that level of control. You're not going
right.
to have that sort of understanding of what's going on in
Yeah.
the field. So really, field safety really takes, you have to take that step back and build partnerships with those research groups, and give them the resources that they need to make it the easy choice, make safety easy for them.
Mhm.
And that might be templates, that might be resources, that might be, instead of just asking them to put together a communication plan, being like, hey, here's this Inreach device, why don't you take it with you and see how it works for you. It really is a unique environment, and there are things that might sort of fall under the regulatory side in terms of first aid training and first aid access, and those might sort of be options or opportunities to sort of start a conversation about overall safety in the field. From the regulatory side, like people are looking at things, this is starting to get, people do get fined for bear attacks.
Mhm.
That did happen in Wyoming fairly within the last 10 years. So that's something that you open the conversation with. The regulations may be coming.
Mhm.
How is it going? But also understand that people have been doing field work successfully for a very long time.
Right.
And we don't have to stop everything and have a program in place before we allow people to go back in. That's really
Sure.
not going to work. So, in terms of making sure that, those relationships that you build with these researchers, that you are able to sort of provide information and resources. And if you have metrics on incidents, and if you get those reports where maybe a specific research group is having a hard time managing safety in the field, that
Sure.
you sort of build those pathways through leadership. Be like, well, there's a problem here, and we can support that. We can identify that because of XYZ evidence. And that then it becomes sort of like any other situation, laboratory safety or not, where you sort of have to escalate to leadership.
Sure. No, absolutely. Heather, what about from your perspective?
Yeah, definitely. When you talk about leadership and figuring out what is happening in the field. EH&S is not the direct supervisor of all of these researchers going out to the field. So, it's important for the researchers, for their supervisors, for PIs to understand kind of where those levels of responsibility are. Like you, as a PI, it's up to you to to make sure that your field staff, that your grad students have the resources they need to be safe in the field. And
Right.
if as a PI you think they're not, following those safety plans, again, the PI needs to look into that a little more. But the other thing that I was thinking of, I wrote down why, as Miriam was talking, like why are they not following those field safety plans? Because generally people want to be safe, right? People want to get their work done efficiently and come home at the end of the day uninjured and comfortable and happy. And so if someone is doing things that we would call unsafe, things that are either against policies and regulations or just not following their own plans and their own procedures, there's probably a reason. It might be too difficult to do things according to the plan. It might take too much time. They might not have the resources they need, or they might not understand why they need to do things in a certain way. So really, it's about getting down to that why, and then making it easier for them to do the right thing.
Yeah, I think the coordination with the conditions change. Like the plan is you write before you go, and then you go there, and all of a sudden the bridge that was supposed to be there is washed out, and there's no crossing for miles in either direction. What do you do? Like, there's certainly lots of conditions in the field that make it very difficult to adhere to something that you wrote in a nice office 1,000 miles away.
Right. And I think we all want them to make the smart decisions. And sometimes those include being a little more risk tolerant and other times more risk averse. And I think what we often see is a mix of risk perceptions. And so just because, we do this for a living and have initials after our name doesn't necessarily mean that our perceptions of the risk are always the correct ones to have. We're very subjective creatures. And so these risk perceptions will differ. And so, and Richard did add to this in a very good way. I liked it because this was the direction I was going to suggest. We've been trying to do a quote cultural shift versus a regulatory side at OSU. We want you to do the right thing versus us chiding you. And that's, I think, what all of us would really recommend is if there's one place that really is key for safety culture, it would certainly be in the field where there is no oversight or supervision, except really for the most part, the group itself or the person themselves. So very good discussion here. Brock's question is next. Do you provide training to your field researchers on off-road driving? And I know we've talked about not doing too much, but I thought we would ask this anyway. Brock posted it, and I can't remember who, but I'm going to go to Heather only because I'm aware at UC Davis, because I know her and she is a friend, that there is a bioag engineering researcher who actually does research on ATV safety, Dr. Farzana Korzani. So just curious if that might be a direction to go, have one researcher provide training or an education to another researcher. But Heather, please, whatever your thoughts were.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Farzani is a great resource for ATV safety. definitely. And, as far as off-road driving, I'm thinking more, of like pickup trucks, driving
Yeah.
on forest roads that are not maintained at all, going really remote. We don't have anything like that on campus, but there are some outside training companies that we can send you to get that training. So
Yeah.
if you're at UC Davis, get in touch with me. I can help you make that connection.
Yeah, and if
But
you're in Arizona, I've got a buddy who does so much camping and off-roading that if he could do it on the side, I'm sure he could do a very good job of it too. But I'm sure there are outfits. Miriam, what about from your perspective? What would you do if you were approached on this specific request?
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely some commercial options available. We get this for like that specialty training. We would sort of do some investigation. It might also be something that the insurance companies that the university works with might have some recommendations for ones that they would consider. We have that more for regular vehicle, like some safe driving classes, and they would actually bring sort of instructors to the university for that particular training session for like defensive driving and something like that. But something more specific to ATVs, there might be some ag schools have like the extension offices that might have a program set up. There might be sort of other sort of commercial entities that do that. And again, if you've got a wilderness sort of adventure program, they might have some sort of contacts for that kind of stuff, for
Nice,
ATV
nice.
stuff.
And Mary, thank you so much. It's so wonderful having people here. Everyone's so great trying to chime in here. And of course, to your colleagues and friends. So Mary Corrigan has posted a nice link for remote road travel and resources and all of that. Thank you again very much, Mary. I'm going to leave that there. I may even copy it right into the chat at the same time. And Jeff has a question. It's really our last one so far. And that is, how do you approach health, occupational health, obviously, discussions with researchers? Flip side, especially for groups traveling together, how do you approach sharing of personal health data that might be important in an emergency? And I think one of the examples we have, of course, is persons who maybe have severe allergies, say like to bees, and may go into anaphylaxis, into the EpiPens, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'll ask Miriam to start.
Yeah, so I mean, this is kind of the thing that there's a couple different ways that this could be managed. We also want to make sure that people understand that disclosure is voluntary, and occasionally when you have like some of these situations where you've got a supervisor asking for something personal information from somebody they supervise, they might not feel that that's a voluntary disclosure. So there are some issues here that we're working with our legal department and our health center to make sure that it's easy for people to sort of navigate in terms of that. However, one thing that we really try to recommend is alert bracelets or wallet cards with QR codes, where something that somebody would carry on their person that would have that medical history, those emergency contacts that would be available, and that people would know that you're wearing, or that it was in your wallet or in your backpack, that would be able to have all of the information, medical dosages, conditions, blood type, all of that information that might be really useful in the field. There's some of that stuff that can sort of be managed personally, like you have that on your person, and you maintain control over that information until it is time for an emergency response situation. And I think that's really the best recommendation that we sort of provide. At least at this point, we don't have anything central to the university that could support that.
Sure. Yeah. And Heather, what do you want to add to this, please? I know OCHealth is partnered in with EHS under safety services at UC Davis, so that makes that aspect easier. But on this whole topic, please.
Yeah, I think Miriam's suggestion about having the individuals manage their own emergency health information like on their person is a great suggestion, because then you don't run into those questions about how do you keep those records, how do you maintain them or destroy them,
right.
who are you asking what questions, because that all gets pretty tricky and muddy. So, for individuals, I would just recommend talking directly with your OC Health department, talking with HR about privacy, talk with your study abroad program, because they've been managing student health information for years, and they have
Right.
protocols around that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, please continue.
Oh yeah, and it's, just with field work, of course, it's absolutely natural for individuals to want to share that information with other people on the team in case something does happen. So again, in the field, you're not immediately near a clinic or hospital often.
Right. I do recall conversations, it was probably in the SHEMA community of practice that you've both been in, obviously, even much more so than I, and that there were discussions, and if one of you mentioned this and I was zoning out, I apologize, that to have people write out their own, put it into an envelope, seal it with their name on it, and it only gets opened under an emergency where it's necessary. Otherwise, it just stays private the entire time. So I recall discussions about that. Obviously, again, there's a certain voluntary aspect to it. And most of us, I know I would want to say, oh, if this all of a sudden happens to me, here's what you need to do, right? I would want people to know that, right? Yeah. So we're almost out of time. I'm going to ask for one more question here that I will pull, because I think it's a good one for us to end on. And it's one that the three of us have talked about. So what about the issue of how do we figure out what is our due diligence? What is duty of care? There's different areas of liability that we might think of, legal, moral, ethical, a lot of which we've talked about today. So how do you, and can you do it in about a minute and a half? Tell us what your thoughts are. Heather, I will ask you first, and then Miriam, you will have the last word on this, and I will close us out for the day.
Yeah, so definitely there's a difference, I guess, between whether you're talking about undergraduate students or employees. Just legally, there are differences there, but as a health and safety professional, we have to do our best to provide the right resources, provide good advice, good information, and encourage people to do the right thing, and also, make everybody know that everybody has a role to play in their own safety and the safety of their team. So just to communicate that as well as possible.
Great, thank you. And Miriam, what would you briefly say to this one as well?
Get involved with your general counsel. I think, it's very important, especially in ways that it plays out differently in field environments. Like you can't necessarily, you could kick somebody out of the lab for, not behaving safely. You can't put somebody on a bus back to their house and call it a day. Like there's a duty of care if somebody is on a trip with you, even if they're, not necessarily acting in an appropriate way, there might be like consequences on, for making a decision for kicking them out of the field group, or making a decision sort of on the fly in a field environment, addressing harassment, sort of addressing mental health crises. Like there's a lot of things that sort of come into play that don't really sort of come into play on a laboratory, group in a similar situation. So it is more complicated. There are a lot of levels of nuance. There are sort of understandings of who's included under the umbrella of the university and who is not. They might be a part of the same research party, like, a research group, but there might be volunteers, or there might be collaborators from other institutions who's responsible. If you're the head of that research group, you might have people that you're not responsible for, or that, external people that you might hire as guides or personal protection, or, drivers. Like, what is your responsibilities there? Like, there's a lot of interlocking, nuance that is just not really well defined, and starting to think about understanding what the experiences are with people, and then sort of talking through those with, general counsel and with your, director of safety, risk management, those entities, and just really sort of understand where your institution is. Where's the sort of tolerance for the university in terms of how much risk are they going to take on?
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned risk management. Waivers don't fix things in the field, but they're certainly necessary. And risk management does a lot more than just waivers, but it's an important aspect. So thank you very much for bringing that up. Well, this is going to end it for the day. Thank everyone for remaining. We still have 59 people joining us, so at least 55 others besides the 4 of us here. So on behalf of the panelists, thank you both very much, Heather and Miriam, for joining us and sharing your expertise. And on behalf of everyone here in the BioRaf family, thank you all for coming. Please continue to come to these. We will be having many more in the future, and we really look forward to seeing you at these. Thank you all very, very much. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.